Since Melissa kindly introduced me in both my aspects, which is both as a critical scholar and as a poet, perhaps I will start off by reading a poem, and if we have time we can come back and discuss the creative element a little bit more. A prospect of beauty and unjustness. I walk down Herencraft, where pigeons dip their necks like question marks into the fountain, then left at long, while the sun slips towards the sea and the moon takes its place above Signal Hill. Above me, starlings clatter like typewriters. Higher still, turning right at Whale, seagulls tilt like white kites against the wind. I step on the old silences of the city. Here is the place on the hill where artists came for peace and a view of a harbour. Below, the city reveals itself. We still walk the neat streets of their paintings. Under the angled mountain, its blue light, the starlings are cold, but looking at them, I see the loveliness of their chaotic and coordinated hunger. What can explain this exact and unjust beauty? The flock clusters at sunset for warmth and seed. Poetry cannot be afraid of this. Sketching the streets, the artists stood on the burial ground of the city's slaves. In the paintings is something of the private grief of their bodies. In precise patterns, the starlings follow one another and redouble on their own flight tracks, slipstream of warmth, blood trace of the self. Nothing to begin with, and nothing again. Around me, the air is thick with history. 200 years ago, slaves could no longer be sold. Nothing and nothing again. I look again at the painted city, falling silent at sunset, even the birds stilled. In the last flush of the sun, the city gleams white and hard as bone. That city, in the description, is my own very beautiful hometown, Cape Town, in South Africa. Perhaps some of you even recognized it from the description. And the city is indeed extraordinarily God-given in its beauty, but it has a painful history. And that painful history is part of my own research. And today I will tell you about the broader history of Islam in South Africa, and then perhaps I get back a little bit to what first drew me to start researching that topic. Most of you will know that in April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election ever. And Nelson Mandela was elected president of the country in that election. But 1994 was also, in fact, the 300th anniversary of the presence of Muslims in the country. And that is less known. Because from the inception of the Cape Colony, which is where Cape Town is located, Dutch settlers brought Muslim slaves to the Cape from territories around the Indian Ocean. And that meant from East Africa, Malagasy, and Mozambique, as well as from India and Southeast Asia. And so from the beginning of what we think of as the colonial history of South Africa, Islam has been present. But it has been present in the very particular context of slavery. And so, as you know, South Africa is much more famous for its recent history, which is the history of the legalized system of racial separateness and hierarchy and division called apartheid. And apartheid came into being in 1948, and it was ended by that democratic election of 1994, which was the first time in my life that I ever voted. So because apartheid is necessarily and justly what most people think about and study and discuss when it comes to South Africa, the earlier history to which I refer, the history of slavery and its much older agonies, tends not to be spoken about very much. And the reason I became so interested in the topic of Islam in South Africa is that the absence of slavery struck me as a crucial emptiness in our national discussion about ourselves. And I'll give you two examples of why it is important for a country which is trying to reconstitute itself after a period of great racialized division and conflict, why it is important to look at an older period of agony. And I'll give you two examples. One example is a very painful word, which I certainly don't want to give any additional currency, but it is a word, of course, that you will recognize an analogy for in the United States. The word in South Africa is kafir. Some of you might have heard it. It's an extremely abusive, rude word. It's unacceptable to say in any kind of company. In fact, it's used as a hate crime in South Africa today. Kafir is the word in South Africa which is used as a racialized label of abuse. So it is used, in fact, towards black people to indicate just how dehumanized black people were under the system of apartheid. That is the way that that word is known in South Africa today. But in fact, the word has a much older history which points directly to the period of slavery, because the word, in fact, comes originally from its use within Islam, and it is a word used for non-believers in Islam. And the later racialized meanings that the term accrued in South Africa came in the course of that colonial and apartheid history. And in fact, in South Africa, the word had diverged so far from its original religious meanings that it was actually used for Muslim people in South Africa. So while we know this word from its contemporary meanings, its history points to the need to look at that older history of South Africa and the way that slavery shaped our understanding of who belongs in South Africa, who is a stranger in South Africa, and who we feel an affiliation and loyalty to, and who we feel contempt towards. So I said I would give you another example besides this linguistic term. As you know, apartheid was in fact the name given to a legal system instituted from 1948 through which every citizen of South Africa was given a racial label. So for instance, everybody in this room, if you were a citizen of South Africa, would have had on your identity document not only your name and your sex, but also your racial category. And these racial categories were invented in 1954 with an act called the Population Registration Act. And that Population Registration Act created three racial labels: white, native, or the term that was used for black people in that period, and then this intermediate term called colored. And the boundaries between blackness and coloredness, and between coloredness and whiteness, were precisely the place where the apartheid state policed its activities most ardently. I'll give you an example of just how somebody would have been categorized between such labels if there were any question mark. I'm going to demonstrate to you the scientific method that the South African state used to determine racial identity. This was called the pencil test, and it was the scientific method through which the South African state enforced these fictional racial categories. Where did it get these racial categories from? Those of us who know, who live in other parts of the world, know white, native, and colored are not terms that are necessarily legible in other parts. So where did the South African state in 1950 get these racial labels from? And in fact, it got them from the period of slavery and just afterwards. That whole notion of the meaning of citizenship attached to skin color emerged during the period of slavery. And therefore, my contention that it is very important to look at this somewhat understudied area.